Hey guys, you're watching Tech Edit. I'm Basil. This is the Sony Xperia 1 Mark VI. This is Sony's latest flagship, and on paper it's worse than the 1 Mark V in a lot of respects. Sony's gone from a 4K screen to a full HD screen. Out of the box when this launches, there's no pro video app, which is kind of what Xperias have become known for. And Sony's also ditched the 21:9 really unique aspect ratio of the screen, gone with a 19.5:9. Very mainstream, and this phone still costs a lot of money. What's going on? Don't worry, I've loved my last couple of weeks with this thing, so stay tuned to find out exactly why. The screen, the battery life, the new continuous zoom from 85 through to 170 millimeters has really impressed me. Before I dive into it though, if you're not already subscribed to the channel, please do. It's how you're going to stay on top of everything that I do, including more Xperia 1 Mark VI stuff. But for now, let's get into this review. The first question is, what is the Xperia 1 Mark VI? This is Sony's flagship for 2024. The 1 Series always is, and well, historically, like I said, they've been 21:9 super wide cinematic screens, this time 19.5:9, but a lot of Sony fan favorites are back. You've got those front firing speakers, no punch hole or notch on the front, just an uninterrupted view. There's a 3.5mm headphone jack and a SIM card tray you can pull out with a fingernail. This also looks and feels very Sony. And you also have a very modest camera bump around the back. No big Xiaomi 14 Ultra or Honor Magic 6 Pro behemoths. And Sony's always prioritized that slimline design. But there are some really cool updates to the 1 Mark VI. It's the first Sony phone with a vapor chamber cooling system, so it's going to be awesome for gaming, especially paired with those front firing speakers. In addition, that wider screen makes it a little bit more comfortable to type on, and Sony's gone for a new battery technology. It's denser, so you're able to, according to Sony, get up to 2 days of power out of this thing. And let's not forget that camera. The main and ultra wide cameras are the same as the 1 Mark V, but the 1 Mark VI has a continuous telephoto with that 85 to 170 reach I was telling you about, making it very unique and hopefully improving the zoom, which was a pain point on the 1 Mark V. So all of that makes this a very interesting phone, mainstreaming in a lot of ways, but simultaneously very Sony. A final point to note, when we were briefed on this phone, Sony said the Pro video features will be available in an update this autumn. You do get some basic Pro video features, and I'll talk about those in the camera section. But now let's kick off by examining the design in more detail. At 192 grams and 8.2 millimeters thin, the 1 Mark VI is relatively light for a flagship smartphone, and it doesn't feel too thick. Now, there are no curved sides, so it doesn't taper and have that very slimline edge feel, but the sides do bevel in a little bit, so they don't feel super thick. And also with that striated metal frame, it's got a nice amount of grip to it too. Those striped frame elements paired with that dotted glass back also gives some nice textural variance, and it feels like a very considered phone, distinctly Sony. But being a little bit wider, more squat, it has a more iPhone-like profile from the front. It also doesn't have a huge camera bump, which is very Sony, and I appreciate that. There's a real attention to it being manageable, and it feels premium, IP68 water resistant, durable. The back is Gorilla Glass Victus, the front is Gorilla Glass Victus 2. All the buttons on the right hand side, volume rocker, power button that doubles up as a fingerprint scanner, and a really nice, relatively spongy in a good way, with some click feedback 2-stage camera button, which can actually be integrated into gaming. You can have it activate a couple of things with Game Enhancer. I really like the feel. I like the look as well. It's available in 3 colors: khaki, green, platinum, silver, and this black version I've got here. And the black version paired with a black backbone controller just looks like a really cohesive, awesome thing. I'll talk about the screen in more detail later, but paired with that controller, PS Remote Play on this aspect ratio is great. And also being a little bit wider, it's more comfortable to type on for anyone who has oversized hands like me. So while a lot of people might not like the fact that Sony stepped away from 21:9. At the very least, they've kept the essence of what makes a Sony phone in that new revised 19.5:9 aspect ratio. Also, I really like the fact there's an eSIM in here. Pull out the SIM tray with a fingernail and you can put in a SIM card, a micro SD card, and that second SIM is via eSIM, so you kind of get the best of both worlds. Onto the screen, and with a 6.5-inch Full HD Plus screen with a resolution of 1080 by 2340, the display has a pixel density of 396. Now this isn't bad by any means. Apple defined Retina displays as 300 plus, where your eye wouldn't make out a pixel, but it is less sharp than other flagships. For example, the Xperia 1 Mark V 4K display, 643 pixels per inch. Incredibly sharp, but also not very power efficient. And brightness was an issue, pumping light through that really condensed pixel array. Then there's the iPhone 15 Pro Max with a pixel density of 460 pixels per inch and the Pixel 8 489. Both of those a bit less sharp than the Samsung Galaxy S24 Ultra, which has a pixel density of 505 pixels per inch. So what does this mean? If you're coming from an Xperia 1 Mark V, I wouldn't worry one bit. Sony actually rendered most of the stuff in that phone at full HD. So you're getting a similar experience, but with battery saving benefits and a 50% brighter display. So it's much easier to see outdoors. The extra width you get from that really does make it more comfortable to type on. And the display's viewing angles and general picture quality is solid. You may have seen my 5 Mark V review. I did not like that display. We haven't got a rinse and repeat here. This is a solid panel, Bravia technology as well, optimizing that picture. Sony says it incorporates some AI, and this is the first Sony phone with a variable 1 to 120 Hertz refresh rate, so battery saving benefits come in there too. In fact, Sony mentioned it's a 4K panel, the 4K display resolution, that prevented them from incorporating a variable refresh rate in the past. So if you need your phone to have good battery life, you will definitely prefer it having this resolution over a 4K display as on past Xperia phones. Therefore, this screen is very good, even though on paper you might not have thought it would be. If you're a fan of excellent audio quality, the Xperia 1 Mark VI is at the top of the pack for me personally. Yes, there's a headphone jack. Yes, there are those front-firing speakers, but dive into the settings and you can tune that audio quite nicely. There is Dolby sound for super loud, boosted immersive audio, and DSEE Ultimate for more nuanced sound. You can either let the phone make all the choices or you can override it and choose. And the clarity from the front speakers is so good. When gaming in particular, sound being projected forward, just didn't even need to use headphones. So really enjoyed that. And watching on as well, when you're holding it sideways, like I said earlier, you're not going to cover those speakers up, making this an ultimate multimedia powerhouse. The Xperia 1 Mark VI may be making headlines because it's finally ditched those 3 camera apps and squished them into one, but the hardware is very impressive too. I'm going to start by covering the specs, and the main camera is exactly what we saw on the 1 Mark V. 1/1.35 inch sensor, XMOR-T for mobile, and it's got an f1.9 aperture, 48 effective megapixels as well. So it's going to perform well based on what we've seen in the past. The ultra-wide's also same thing. You've got a 12 megapixel camera with an f2.2 aperture, and it's 1/2.5 inch sensor, but it's a telephoto camera that has been upgraded this year. It's still a continuous zoom, but this time it reaches further. At 85 millimeters, it's an f2.3 aperture, but when you punch into the 170 millimeters, then it's an f3.5 aperture. So what you end up with on here is a very unique camera system thanks to that upgraded continuous reach. Will it be a little bit soft like the 1 Mark V zoom? I'll dive into all the pictures I took on this in a sec, but there's some more specs to talk about. First off, this phone also has 399 focus points. Sony implements AI from the Alpha line that can estimate poses, also has autofocus for eyes as well as faces, and it has subject tracking too. So there's a lot going on here under the hood. The lenses are Zeiss lenses as well. This thing can record 4K video at up to 120 frames per second with video at 24 or 30 or 60 frames per second as well. Sony's also improved the bokeh mode, and it supports bokeh video as well from the front and rear camera. And the front camera is a 12 megapixel sensor with an f2 aperture and a 24mm angle of view. So on paper, while there's a lot of familiar stuff here, there's enough new for us to really sink our teeth into. I'm a bit confused as to why Sony launched its camera app with such pared back functionality. Okay, photography fans, you will be fine on this thing. You have a camera app that has full manual control as well. There are some really nice intuitive elements, and it can also shoot 48 megapixel photos. Not 48 megapixel RAWs, they're still 12 megapixel unfortunately, but still, it's a step in the right direction. But video fans, you're gonna struggle a little bit more. If you shoot auto video, there's no issues here. But for fans of the old Cinema Pro and Video Pro application, you can't shoot 21:9 here. You haven't got full control over that manual video experience. There is some control. You can manually adjust focus. You can manually adjust shutter speed as well. There's product showcase and a bunch of settings that you can choose from. But things like rack focus, Sony's Venice profile, for example, none of that's here. So I really think Sony missed a trick by not including the old Video Pro and Cinema Pro apps on this phone at launch and then making them uninstallable after the update. Fans of auto mode and more classical photography will really like the Xperia 1 Mark VI. Its photos do lean towards cooler hues than Apple, Samsung, overexposes a little bit rather than lean towards HDR-esque, pulling all of those highlight details through. So it isn't across the board win for typical mobile users, but that more traditional kind of photography with more limited dynamic range, because there's less computational stuff going on here, is quite effective, especially when you fire up that exposure slider, drop the exposure and take a lower exposure photo, plenty of detail in the shadows that you can pull out afterwards as well. There's raw capture as well if you want to go manual, and with that you can save even more shadow detail. However, it's very clear that Sony doesn't shy away too much from noise. Saturation and sharpening aren't too bumped up, though there is a fair bit of contrast applied to JPEGs on this thing. Nighttime photography is hit and miss. There is an auto night mode on here, and it can take a really nice shot, especially if you pull down that exposure, but leave it to its own devices and it can overexpose in auto mode at night, creating muddy skies, which I'm not a fan of. And obviously if you don't have a super steady hand, you're going to get blurry subjects in frame. Now all of that might sound very familiar because this is mainly covering the primary camera. As for the ultra wide, again, very similar to what we've seen before, has autofocus and takes a good picture up close, less so when the lights drop. But the telephoto camera is what's very interesting. Obviously you've got that really broad zoom range, and that 170mm focal length means you're going to get stunning portrait shots with that eye autofocus working to great effect when the lighting is right. At night the zoom will struggle, but with a steady hand you can still get respectable punched in photos. It's also worth noting Sony doesn't employ AI zooming, which is very popular on Oppo, Xiaomi phones, for example. And what that does is it kind of demosaics the pixels that you get when you punch right in, go beyond the optical zoom length, and it will create an estimation of what the photo should look like. Sony leans into pixelating, which actually, again, a lot of photographers who really like traditional pictures will appreciate and prefer, because it's more a what you see is what you get situation with the 1 Mark VI. So when it comes to photography, in a nutshell, the 1 Mark VI carries forward what past Xperia 1 phones have done and lean towards more traditional photography values. 48 megapixels as well, I didn't mention, produces pictures that are supremely croppable, very nice and good light. When the lights drop, lean towards those 12 megapixel JPEGs. Video is going to be more interesting, obviously, with those more pared back manual options, but Honestly, I just enjoyed 4K up to 120 frames per second so much. 4K portraits also look really nice in video. You can punch in at people and you've got natural background separation. There is that bokeh video mode, but probably not one for most typical Xperia users. For you guys, the extra zoom range, stabilization is good, not so great once you punch beyond the 130mm mark, but overall frame rates were smooth, colors look good, noise handling at night also wasn't terrible, and when you dial down the exposure a little bit, you can create footage that's very nice to play with afterwards. I just really wish Sony told us at least what was going to be dropping in autumn, rather than leave us with a manual video experience that feels honestly a little bit underbaked and lacking, especially considering the heritage of the Xperia 1 line. There's another aspect to the 1 Mark 6's photos and videos that deserves a section unto itself: macro photography, because this is the first phone other than the P60 Pro and the Pura 70 series that can capture incredible super close up tele macro photos that just blow my mind. Okay. Now the telephoto camera punches in obviously a variable range, but at roughly the 120mm mark, it can shoot at as near as 4 centimeters from a subject at 4K resolution up to 120 frames per second, or take stills as well. That is mind-boggling stuff. So you're talking about a roughly 5 times plus zoom with macro. The results look incredible, especially if you like photographing flowers, insects, the tiniest fabrics on your jeans. You can do it all with this phone. They aren't as sharpened as those of the P60 Pro, for example, so they don't have the clarity instantly, and the depth of field is so shallow that you can actually miss the mark when you're taking a photo. I had much better experiences recording a high frame rate video. Helps if you're in bright situations, and then pulling that 4K still. It's 12 megapixels at the end of the day. Editing that up, sharpening it, punching up the colors, really blows my mind that Sony has included that in a continuous zoom camera phone. Now in the app it says that you can zoom in on that. You can't actually, it's a digital zoom, just insofar as it macro performs at 120mm, and I know that because no matter how zoomed in or out you are, the aperture remains at f2.8, but that doesn't even matter for me. If you like macro photography, there is no other phone out there that can touch this other than possibly the P60 Pro and the Pura 70 Ultra and Pro. My controversial opinion with regard to the Xperia 1 Mark 6 is that it is my new favorite gaming phone. Now I know with phones like the Red Magic 9 Pro, which have fans in them, and the ROG phone, that makes no sense, but actually when you balance camera and that hardware set, front firing speakers, flat sides, a flat display, no punch hole or notch, the Sony Xperia 1 Mark 6 has it all. You can see I've got it hooked up to the backbone controller here, and for games that have controller support like Solo Leveling Arise that just came out, Streets of Rage 4 for example, it is such a treat. Don't want to use a controller, Genshin Impact plays back really well, and Sony's game enhancer is better than ever. And Sony's included a frame rate stabilizing feature that balances performance to keep those frame rates stable, and also manages background processes as well. On top of that, I noticed this phone actually gets a little bit hotter than the Xperia 1 Mark 5, which I criticized for throttling a bit too aggressively. Heat might sound like a bad thing, but actually heat is how you know that the phone is really working to drive the most steady frame rates possible. And as a result, I found gaming and performance and graphics to just look fantastic on this thing. When you're gaming, most games don't render above full HD, so the low resolution screen wasn't an issue at all. Everything looked fantastic. Now I couldn't run any benchmarks on here because I have such an early review device, but with a Snapdragon 8 Gen 3, 12GB of RAM, you can see how other phones with similar hardware perform, and the vapor chamber cooling system in here obviously did a good job of helping keep frame rates nice and high. I'm guessing that extra size based on the wider screen is a big part of how Sony made this phone so much better for gaming than past Xperias. I don't know, just a guess on my side. But ultimately, if you do like gaming and you do want an Xperia phone, this is the best out there. Depending on where you are, you can either get 256 gigabytes of storage or 512 gigabytes. This version has 256 gigs, but with that micro SD card, you can up that by 1.5 terabytes, which is very, very tasty. Running Android 14 out of the box, it's nice to see Sony has finally committed to a little bit more software support. Promises 3 years of operating system updates and 4 years of security updates for the One Mark 6, which isn't class leading, but it's something. In addition, the interface ran very smoothly. Even when the battery went right down, it didn't throttle quite as aggressively, still stuttered a little bit, but generally speaking, I like what Sony's done. Also side sense, it's not a double tap now to activate it. You can swipe it in, swipe up, swipe down. The interaction just feels a little bit more intuitive, more similar to what other manufacturers are doing. There are still some things I'd like to see on here. For example, when I organize my apps on my home screen, I can't pinch out, select multiple, drag them into a folder, etc. But that's getting into the nitty-gritty. Pure stability and functionality is really solid, and if you like what Sony's done in the past, you'll probably like what they're doing now. Possibly the most impressive thing about the Xperia 1 Mark 6 is actually its battery. Its 5000 milliamp cell should not be impressive on paper because it's exactly what we've seen in the past, but for some reason this phone lasts for ages. Sony promises 2 days and I don't think they're far off. In fact, I reckon with moderate use or light use you could even get a little bit more than that. When I was watching content on it at 75% brightness with a SIM card in there and over Wi-Fi, it only drained by 2% after half an hour. A whole film that was 3 hours drained it by 8%. If you're gaming, that draining will happen faster. A 30-minute Genshin Impact session, maximum graphics, performance mode on 60 frames per second. That was 10% in half an hour. So that is significantly nippier. But I think Sony's made the screen much, much more power efficient, and it really pays off for anyone who doesn't always get to a charger by the end of the day. Sony's also implemented battery care in here too. So it promises 4 years of healthy battery life. If you want the fastest charging possible, you're probably better off looking elsewhere. I think it's 30-watt charging on here. Sony didn't specify, but I plugged it into a power delivery charger and it powered up fully in 1 hour 20 minutes. After half an hour you can get 50% battery life, a little bit more actually, so that should get you through a day based on my experience with this thing. So it isn't terrible, but it definitely isn't your 120 watt charging that you see on some other flagships. So in a nutshell, the Sony Xperia 1 Mark 6 is definitely my kind of smartphone. It's excellent for gaming, the front firing speakers, really difficult to cover up. We also have that headphone jack. Battery life lasts for ages and the screen looks really, really good. I don't miss the 4K display one bit. Also, little things like that SIM card you can pull out with a fingernail and the inclusion of an eSIM, all very solid. Camera isn't my favorite, I'm not gonna lie. The processing is a little bit too pared back and I miss big 1-inch sensors for a few reasons, not least of all dynamic range when the lights drop. But having said that, the camera is still great, really, really solid. It's an expensive phone though, so I'd expect nothing less. And because of that, I have got a wish list of items that I would want Sony to have included. 16 gigabytes of RAM, for example, to really future-proof it. On top of that, a 512 gigabyte storage capacity starting point would have been really good. Starts at 256 gigabytes, but you do still have that SD card expansion at least. Within the camera UI, I would have also really appreciated a zoom slider, which you don't have, which just would have prevented you having to pinch the screen, which is what you have to do. And you haven't got a particularly far max zoom reach, around 21 times zoom. So I appreciate Sony isn't including AI zoom in here, but I still would have liked the option to punch in a little bit further. Finally, the Sony watermark. I know that it's kind of like become quite common for brands like Honor, Oppo and Xiaomi to have those Leica type watermarks with the parameters that you shoot in, so shutter speed, ISO, etc. But Sony fans are quite proud of their Sony Xperia camera phone, so I think they would very much appreciate something like this. Personally, I would, just so that I know how this thing is thinking without having to dive into the EXIF data. That's very geeky though. Generally speaking, day to day, love this phone. Let me know what you think. Do you think this is a worthwhile upgrade for anyone with a 1 Mark IV or 1 Mark V? Or do you think Sony's actually turning its back on its hardcore fans? Obviously, the real issue with this, if you're a videographer, is the lack of transparency with what's going to drop with the autumn update for that pro grade video, Cinema Pro, Video Pro relationship. Watch this space. If you like the video, thumbs up, like the channel, subscribe, and let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. Thanks for watching.